So our world doesn't run on electricity. Electricity represents just 20% of the final energy consumed all over the world. We have been selling the idea that we can electrify everything, and this is false because electrifying everything requires a lot of resources that are not cheap and are not abundant. Copper production seems to have attained the maximum production. We have problems also to ramp up even more lithium production. And we have other materials that, in fact, are not enough in order to keep the idea that we are going to electrify everything. And we are going probably to have a burst of the renewable bubble because this has been a bubble.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Antonio Turiel. Antonio is a physicist and a mathematician who works as an environmental scientist at the Institute of Marine Sciences at the CSIC in Spain. A number of my listeners have suggested I get Antonio on the show for years now, I have to admit. And we've had back and forth over the years and finally managed to pin down a date. Outside of academia, Antonio is well known for writing the website The Oil Crash, which investigates the intersection of our economies and materials and resources and energy and how, frankly, we're running out. Just before we hit record, we discussed what we would speak about on the episode. We sort of ended up landing on, well, tell you what, Antonio, you just answer the first question and I'll try to keep up with you. And that is exactly what I tried to do, because this is a very, very big picture conversation, which touches on everything from fossil fuel production to male supremacy. Antonio begins by explaining the reality of fossil fuel production, that in fact fossil fuel production is not increasing year on year, despite what the charts say, despite something that I've said over and over again on the show. He explains that the derivatives of fossil fuels that produce actual fuel are not increasing year on year, but in fact the derivatives which produce plastic are, and when you combine them together, it makes fossil fuel look like it's going up, but in reality, the fuel part of fossil fuel production is going down. Now, why is that important? Well, because a world in which resources are scarce and fossil fuels are scarce is a world of political panic. We discuss how the diesel shortage is impacting places like Argentina and Europe with very lived results for people on the ground, including food shortages and certain countries capping their production in order to ensure that they can continue to export oil in order to fund their economies. And we also look at Trump's tariffs and his decisions to drill baby drill through this lens, with Antonio explaining what the ripple effect will be through the global trading system, creating isolated islands of manufacturing and production, which explains the EU's decision for rearmament using Russia as a proxy or as a ghost, essentially, to quote-unquote militarize the minds of Europeans in order to, as Antonio hypothesizes, invade Northern Africa for their resources. Antonio then explains how this is tied into renewable energy, revealing that European bureaucrats are moving away from the rollout because it has failed, it doesn't work, you cannot run a fossil fuel society on renewable infrastructure. He provides a bunch of evidence to this claim, with a particular focus on electricity, and this then takes us into a conversation on Eco-Fascism. And this is where we stay for the remainder of the episode, discussing a very likely future in which some people have access to a lot and other people have access to very little. You could call it the mirror image of the society we have today, except in the future there won't be a middle class, Antonio argues. And this then bleeds into a conversation about male supremacy on the rise in young people, the reality of women's bodies as natural resource, the fact that we are entering the age of kings again, and importantly, how to resist all of this. That there is something worth fighting for. Of course, first, we need to figure out what is going on, which I very much hope this episode is one of the threads in the tapestry of figuring out what is going on and what needs to be done. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Antonio, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, it's also a pleasure for me.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
I think this is a personal opinion, but based on a lot of research I have done during the last years. And in my opinion, the question is mainly because we are entering in the end game of a combined problem having to do with sustainability, and in particular with a growing scarcity of fossil fuels, of energy in general, the failure of the renewable transitions, mainly in the context of Europe, because Europe, maybe China also, are the places at which the bet has been stronger, and now we realize that it is not working the way it was intended to. And there is also an increasing resource scarcity, resources in general, not only fossil fuels, but everything, copper, for instance. And everything combined with an environmental crisis, which is very serious, which is becoming very dire. This has to do a lot with the research I do at the Institute of Marine Sciences here in Spain. And finally, to wrap it up, we have a serious social crisis that has to do with the loss of purchasing power or income by the majority of people all over the world, and for what we are concerned in the Western countries. So everything together is a mixture which is very explosive, which is very dangerous, because I think is something which is pushing Western countries, I would say Western democracies, but I'm not completely sure about this, Western countries in a direction of becoming more authoritarian, closer to fascism, to be honest, and closer also to older imperialistic ways. So we are already in very imperialistic ways, but they were mainly trade-based. But I think that we are returning to the old-fashioned, the old military fashion. We are going in that direction. But at the end, the question is the lack of sustainability of our system, mainly regarding resources, energy, and also the environmental crisis.
I think we should go through that bit by bit if we can. Let's start with the growing scarcity of fossil fuels. There's been multiple guests on this show that pointed to different research that they've conducted to show that fossil fuels are getting scarcer, particularly to do with return energy on energy investment. So the fact that it's taking more energy to access these fuels that are deeper in the Earth's crust. So at some point, more energy is going to be spent pulling them out of the Earth's crust than you will get from them. But I think for the vast majority of people, the idea of oil or gas being scarce is a little bit confusing, because we still exist in markets whereby, Saudi Arabia is essentially worried that the price of oil isn't high enough, and so manufacturing scarcity in order to drive that price per barrel up. So could you speak to the reality of what do we have in the ground? Can we get it? And when will it run out?
Well, normally, taking account the different views on the subject, my answer is that all of them are correct, which could be a bit paradoxical, but it is actually true. And this is because we tend to simplify the dynamics of scarcity. So scarcity in this case, well, first of all, talking about scarcity when you are pumping more than 100 million barrels of liquid, something similar to oil, let's say oil, per day, which is a huge amount and the greatest amount in all history. Talking about scarcity is a bit stupid, actually. But the main problem is that we are living in an economic system that needs a never-ending growth. So we need to increase and increase and increase never-ending. And what is clear right now is that we have serious troubles in trying to increase the amount of liquid fuels that we are producing currently. And what is happening is that the economic dynamics associated to this difficulty to increase is very complex. So typically people tend to think that once we start to have problems, once the supply is not able to really fully supply the demand, what it should happen is that the price skyrockets and it stays very high for very long, but it is not true. What actually happens is that, of course, you have some spikes of prices, but after a while, you have manufacturers that are running out of business because they cannot afford, they cannot support such a high price. And at the end, you start having a destruction in demand. Also, something that is happening in parallel, and it's something that I can confirm, for instance, in Spain, this is clearly happening. You have degradation of income for the working class. So income is lower and lower compared to the actual prices, because there are many ways of statistically making up these guys what is actually going on. But the question at the end is that if you cannot afford for pay for basic commodities that you need for your daily life, you have a problem. And the question here in Spain, for instance, and it's similar in other places in Europe and in the Western countries, is that it is harder and harder just to maintain the same living standards that you had, for instance, a decade ago. So there is a problem of affordability. And this is also a consequence of energy scarcity. So energy scarcity doesn't show up as constant high prices of energy, but mainly a problem of affordability of everything, essentially in the way of a degradation of income with respect to the living costs, so the living expenditure. So at the end, what we should expect for the next years is that life becomes more complicated. People have more and more problems. That is happening here in Spain, for paying the rent, for paying the groceries, for paying essentially everything they need. But you don't see something, a typical Mad Max scenario in which everything falls apart very suddenly. This is not what usually happens in this kind of context, at least at the beginning of the process. You have in Colombia, you have realized how the situations can become very, 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 very dire. But at the end, nobody realizes that it is associated to this growing scarcity of energy and materials. Scarcity in energy and materials are connected because take into account that you need a lot of energy in any mining operation. And one of the things that, for instance, is happening right now in Colombia and in Bolivia is that people are complaining that they have problems to operate the mining facilities because of the scarcity of diesel. So just the scarcity of diesel is one of the main ingredients of this problem of material scarcity, apart from the impact that it has in agriculture, in transportation, and in everything else. The main problem that we have with diesel is that diesel is the...
Hang on, Antonio. Sorry, I actually have a question before we move on
Yeah.
to that. If I may jump in here, fossil fuel production is increasing every year. So how is it that this is becoming increasingly scarce?
The answer is this statement is false. Because right now we are calling oil, which in fact is, well, I concentrate on oil first, then I will discuss fossil fuels in general. Oil is the most important thing because oil is very important for transportation and in machinery in general. Okay, so the production of oil, apparently, according to statistics, is still slightly increasing during the last years, but it is because some accounting trick, because we are counting inside the all liquids, all liquids of liquids. We are counting a particular category which is called natural gas liquids. Natural gas liquids is a specific thing that comes out with natural gas in the fields where you are obtaining natural gas. And in fact, it's a mixture of several gases. It's not really liquids. So it's mainly butane and propane. And this is useful for producing plastic, but this is not useful as a fuel. So the question is that we're including this category, and it's a way to making up the actual situation. If you go for what is called crude plus condensate, which is the thing, the part of this mixture of the very different things that you're accounting there, that can be converted to the things that you are using in your machine. So, in gas, in diesel, in the things that in kerosene, the things that you are using for running trucks, for running cars, for running planes. Then you realize that the maximum production, the maximum yield, was in November 2018, 7 years ago. And from that point on, it is not increasing. It has decreased a little. It is rather stabilized around between 3-4% below that point. But crude plus condensate is not increasing right now. It's only when you add these natural gas liquids, it seems that the total is increasing. But as I said, natural gas liquids is mainly for developing plastics, not liquid fuels. The problem is that when you look more precisely to the fuels that we are deriving from oil, the serious problem is in diesel. Diesel production attained a plateau in the years going from 2015 to 2017. And from that point on, it has experienced some roller coasters, so sometimes going very down, then up, and so on. But right now, global output, global refinery output of diesel is around 15% lower than it was in this period running from 2015 to 2017. And then we are observing a problem with access to diesel all over the world. This is happening right now in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Argentina past year, even Argentina being an oil producer, they had not enough diesel for all the harvest. So 20% of all the harvest was lost because of a scarcity of diesel. And for instance, something which is quite worrisome, in particular for Spain, but not only for Spain, Nigeria. Nigeria, which is, in the case of Spain, is the main provider of oil for Spain, is limiting the amount of fuels to the people, to the nationals, because they prefer to have more oil for exports, because it's very important source of income. And what is happening is that it is creating a very unstable situation in this country. And this country, as you know, is an overpopulated country. Approximately 1/5 of all Africa population is inside Nigeria. It's a very populated country. And we have many other problems in other places. So for me, the main threat right now associated specifically to oil is what is happening with diesel, because we have not enough diesel to maintain the things like that. So just looking at the production of all liquids that we call oil, in which we include this thing that it serves to make plastics, is quite confusing. You look at the part that has to do with liquid fuels, and you say, okay, this arrived to the maximum in 2018, and from them it's more or less stabilized a bit below that level, 3% below that level. But the main problem is diesel. Diesel is falling faster, something that was actually expected, because you need specific mixtures of hydrocarbons to produce diesel. And during the next years, the situation is likely to be worse, because the main interactions between all the products that we have around, because once diesel starts to be scarce, it creates a lot of problems with the global transportation network, with mining operations here and there. And then you have, these feedback loops that even if potentially you could be able to maintain a larger production, probably you are not going to be able, because you have not enough diesel around. This is another way in which this lack of energy performance, this diminishing energy return on an investment, can show up, because you have a very complex system with many interacting parts, and you can have many disruptions. And the problem with the disruptions, because they are breaking points. So you expect something to be a smooth declining, whatever, but at some time you have a step, you have something that breaks and something that gives, and at the end you are following at a given period of time, and then continue your descending curve, but probably it's going to be rather like a staircase, something that is falling is falling following steps. We are already in this situation. This situation is quite complicated to manage because diesel is really the blood of our economic system. We need diesel for transportation, we need diesel for machinery, we need diesel for agriculture. So if the diesel starts to become scarce, it is a real problem. And for me, this is one of the main threats for Europe because Europe is now as time passes is worse and worse placed to face this diesel crisis that is increasing in the world. Regarding the other fossil fuels, natural gas and coal, none of them have yet arrived to their maximum production. Natural gas seems to be very close because the annual increase is slowing clearly. So last years we have an annual increase of around 0.8%, which is not a very large amount. It's still increasing, but slowing. And it is very likely that the maximum production of gas is going to be passed during the next years. We're going to see when it happens. And in the case of coal, on the contrary, everything seems to indicate that it's very possible and plausible and likely that coal is going to be increasing its production until easily 2030, 2035. And this is very bad news because, from the environmental point of view, coal is the worst fuel that we can use, especially because the type of coals that we are using are increasingly pollutant because are lower grade, more pollutant coals. And this is a bit the situation with fossil fuels.
This shines a very different light on some of Trump's executive orders. And I read that you wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. Most of what Trump does, if you're in a certain camp of politics, kind of gets ascribed to a mad dog chasing cars. But you think that Trump, while he might not be a scientist in heart in any way, he may very well understand that America is going to, quote unquote, need to drill baby drill in order to supply its own energy, quite frankly, in the near future. Could you speak to that, please?
My opinion on what the Trump administration is doing is that, in fact, it may be not morally adequate, but anyway, how we are discussing about morals when typically Western policies are not very moral anyway. But
Yes.
The question is that for me it makes sense that on one hand he is unilaterally imposing a lot of tariffs. So in essence, he's breaking up world trade. In fact, he's violating all the conventions of World Trade Organization, to which, in principle, United States is still affiliated. I don't know if he has removed United States from the World Trade Organization, but by the actual facts, um, he's breaking up all the trading system because once you start to put very strong tariffs, inevitably you create a cascade of effects, and other countries finish for impose some kinds of restriction to the commodities coming from third countries because they need to protect themselves by the fact that the main consumer now is imposing, the main customer is imposing these tariffs on them. So at the end, it creates a cascading effect of worse trade, let's say, more expensive trade, and at the end, less trade. And at the same time, they focus on increasing the extraction in their own country because the United States still has a lot of natural resources for sure. So doing this, they are fostering the reinstallation, the inshoring all the industries that were previously offshore. So they are favoring that all the factories are coming back to the United States that are creating quality jobs, even if the global environment is going to be worse in the sense that the economy is going to be worse, the prices are going to be higher. But if you are regaining some local manufacturing activity, you are probably going to vote better with the situation. And I think that this is his bet. Not only that, but as he is actually crashing the world trade system, favoring also that goods do not travel these huge distances they are traveling right now. So, in fact, probably he will induce a reduction in global CO2 emissions, which is also paradoxical. But in fact, it can work. It can work. The problem with this idea, I think, well, I don't think they have made such a sophisticated thought about the thing. I think they have run straight to the point that we need to retrieve jobs in our country. We need to
Yeah.
retrieve the factories. So what we are going to do, we put all the tariffs to all external goods. So it is better to purchase here than there. And we have resources. We can open all the pits, all the wells, whatever, to extract as much as possible and let the machine run. And for the rest of the world, we don't care. At the same time, take into account that the message to Europe is quite clear. At the end, Europe is not very productive. We have not a lot of resources, but we have high consumption. So, in some sense, we are now something a disturbance. So, uh, they need us to get rid of us, and probably if they could get us poorer, it would be better for their plans. And I think that more or less they are moving in that direction. And actually, this can work for some time. At the end, you cannot avoid the problem with the depletion of resources in general. You are going to crash against peak oil, peak fossil fuels in the long run. This is something that you cannot avoid. But this can run for, I don't know, one term or two terms, taking into account that Donald Trump, as expected, is already saying that he probably will run for another term. So to this guy, it doesn't matter how is his life is, how much is his life expectancy. 10 years, okay. For the next 10 years, this can work. And he can be considered a hero. So I think in that sense, it makes sense. It is perverse and it's very bad news for Europe. But at the same time, take into account that Europe, at the end, we are benefiting of the fact that we were having access to cheap resources that we do not deserve. So, in fact, Europe should take profit of the situation to try to change completely the way in which we relate with the other countries, with other people, and with the world in general, and nature and environment and whatever. But on the contrary, our leaders are betting everything in war because actually they are
Yes.
betting everything.
Yes. Well, I was just going to say, it doesn't really seem that this opportunity is being taken, nor the ability to now craft new relationships founded in a sense of mutuality in order to take on sort of the beast that is the United States, which it has always been, but is now just really revealing itself. And in one of your essays that I read, you wrote about how it's quite likely that Europe will now just invade Africa in order to get its hands on the resources that were previously coming through these global trade routes. And it's really interesting to think about how warming up for rearmament and for war because there's a threat of Russia essentially funds and tricks the public into kind of allowing for all of this militarism sort of coming to the fore again, and then you just direct it elsewhere in order to get resources.
This is exactly my point. In fact, I don't know if you know, but I wrote a post in my blog 4 days ago that was exactly about that. We are creating a phantom menace, a phantom threat that Russia is going to invite us, which is absolutely stupid because Russia has not the ability nor the interest for doing this. What they are actually trying to do is to militarize the minds, which is the first thing. So you need to have a society which is mobilized in that direction, that thinks that the use of the army is a right way of doing things. And once you have earned that, you have achieved that, probably they are going to direct our armies to North Africa, because this has always been the case. I was told some 11 years ago by a guy who at the time was parliamentary in the European Parliament. And that guy was running around the lobbies of the European Commission quite often. And I was commented by him once that, in fact, the guy was quite indignant because he actually told me that the European Commission contemplates the possibility of using manu militari. I don't know if it is said like this in English, but using the army as a way to assure the flow of resources to Europe. This is something that was
Oh,
being
sure.
discussed on European Commission 11 years ago. I am pretty sure that it's still discussed because the powers
Nice.
below the scenes are the same. Even if the person change, the ideas that are inspiring those guys are exactly the same. And for me, the recent movements clearly go in that direction. But my reflection, my thoughts in my post were also that, in fact, this is nothing new. This is funny because I'm a physicist and a mathematician, but it seems that I know a bit more about history than the people that are referring us that typically come from, these social sciences. And this is something that has been observed in other empires along this history, that sometimes, well, empires that are in crisis, that they want to regain the past military glory and try to make an attempt to rearm. It's not the same thing, and try to impose their will using armies and so on. And the effort is too much for those empires, and they finish for collapsing. And this is something that can happen to Europe. Europe can really decompose by the effort of trying to do this, because the main problem with creating an army, a big army especially, is that it consumes a lot of resources given no benefit. So you're just going to pour a lot of resources on that. And the problem is that now resources start to become scarce. One of the main problems with the deindustrialization in Germany is that energy is expensive and commodities are expensive. And they are, I mean, in fact, they are not expensive. Probably they're getting a bit fairer, a bit more fair. But for the way in which German industry works, it's too expensive. And this is the reason why they have all those problems that they are having and so on. In this case, pouring a lot of resources in trying to create this big army, taking into account also that the population is not that easy to manipulate, especially the youngsters, which are completely disenchanted with what the things they are seeing around, saying that they have no expectations,
Yeah.
that the environment is really crashing and so on. So, investing so much in something which is not a productive activity on itself can be a big mistake, can accelerate the composition of Europe. That maybe at the end, this is a good thing, I don't know, but, but especially for the rest of the world. But
Mm.
this is a completely dumb move, and for me, a completely misreading of the actual situation. They are not understanding. They are trying to give standard responses to complicate the situation and so on. Maybe it will be interesting to comment what has happened with the renewable transition, because it has a lot to do with the current moves. Because as you realize, Europe is no longer be so vocal with the renewable transition. In fact, the latest regulations they have approved, this omnibus regulation, is getting one or two steps backwards, in which it refers to environmental protection and the energy transition. Even if they say the contrary, it is actually reducing the ambition by Europe. And it's interesting to know why and what is actually happening. If you want, we can discuss a little on this.
I think just before you jump into that, Antonio, I think it's worth saying that the idea of Europe using its armies to shore up resources is nothing new. And it's actually how all global policy has functioned over the past, 1,000 years, essentially. And Europe was just doing it within the kind of guise of NATO and the United States military being present in, 180 countries around the world and ensuring the flow of what it needed to, also through different economic warfare policies like the common agricultural policy. So just for anybody listening, it's not hearsay. It's actually just how things function. It's just now that it might look more physical because there's obviously this break in relationship between Europe and the United States. But please tie in, weave in renewable energy into the story.
Well, just to say, of course, it's the standard policy. The problem is that the situation is not the standard one.
Yeah.
The question with renewable energy is that they have realized that it doesn't work as they expected. So they were expecting that if you were putting more and more systems to get renewable energy from the environment, they will be going probably to have this energy available for doing the same things they were previously doing was with fossil fuels, exactly the same with renewable energy. And in fact, many people think that this kind of thing can be done. The problem with this is absolutely delusional because it implies not understanding a lot of things about how energy works. The first thing is that we are talking about systems that generate electricity. Electricity is something which is quite good. It's cool. You can do a lot of interesting things with electricity. We can communicate right now using electricity. But at the end, we're using also a lot of other forms of energy. For instance, for the concrete of the building in which you are, I am all the steel, all the metals that are implied, and all the extraction, the manufacturing, and whatever. And none of this is using electricity or very scarce electricity. So our world doesn't run on electricity. Electricity represents just 20% of the final energy consumed all over the world. By final energy, I mean energy which is already usable for in the final use. For instance, oil is primary energy. You need to elaborate it in a fuel, for instance, in diesel to be usable. Diesel is final energy. So electricity is final energy. It's something that you can already consume. It is prepared to be consumed. So the amount of energy which is consumed in the shape of electricity all over the world is 20%. And in industrialized countries, it's a bit more, 22, 23, 24 sometimes, always in the mark of 20 something percent. You have a vast majority of energy which is not consumed in the form of electricity. Typically, it's consumed of some fuels derived from oil or gas or other ways. Okay, so we have been selling the idea that we can electrify everything, and this is false because electrifying everything requires a lot of resources that are not cheap and that are not abundant. So starts to manifest, to show up very clearly with copper. Copper production seems to have attained the maximum production because there is also a peak copper, and it seems that we have already passed in it, if we have not yet passed. And this is creating the copper scarcity. We have problems also to ramp up even more lithium production. And we have other materials that, in fact, are not enough in order to keep the idea that we are going to electrify everything. Also, we are also selling the idea that electrifying things make them more efficient. And this is true in some cases, and this is false in other cases. And in particular, trying to substitute the 1.4 billion cars of the world by electric cars is something that is not likely to work for many, many, many reasons I am not going to discuss into detail. But that regards all the uses, the problem of using energy, materials, having to multiply the grid, the hysteresis of battery, many, many, many things that at the end imply that, of course, this plan is not going to work. And at the end, as you have realized, the Western companies are now putting on hold all their plans for developing selling a lot of electric vehicles because they have realized that this is not working. They are expensive, they have not the same performance, and so on and so on. The other idea will be using green hydrogen. Germany was very fond to this idea, but green hydrogen is a real a sewer of energy, something that consumes a lot of energy, and you create a molecule which is hard to manipulate, very dangerous, created a lot of problems. At the end, it was a completely stupid idea. So green hydrogen makes sense for specific uses in industry as a bad substitute or an expensive substitute for natural gas, but thinking of times in which natural gas will be scarce, this may have some sense for some uses. But in general, and in particular for using in vehicles, this is absolutely dumb. And what is happening right now is that the problem with the scarcity of materials, the problem with electricity on itself, electricity have also many other technical difficulties I'm not going to explain, but the grid now is very unstable because of this. And if you have followed a bit the dispute between Norway and Germany about hydroelectricity, is very interesting because Germany is using a lot of hydroelectricity from Norway to stabilize their own electricity system because the new renewables generate a lot of instability that propagates all over the grid and so on. And Norway, well, they have realized that they are really emptying their dams and not interested in losing the water. Well, so this is a very bad situation. But now with this, So at the end is, okay, summing up, long message short, this is not working. This is not working. And they have been trying to think that this thing was going to work. They have put a lot of money coming from these recovery funds, these next generation funds, in trying to make this. They have given a lot of money to Spain, more than it should correspond to Spain, taking into account its size in population and the geographical size, just because they were thinking that Spain will become a big supplier of renewable energy because we have a lot of territory, we have a lot of sun for sure, but it seems it doesn't work. And what's happening right now is that we have observed that many investment funds are retiring in a movement that at the beginning could be called like a flow, and now I think it's a panic run. And what is happening is something that we realize here in Spain is that many companies start to have a lot of problems, and we are going probably to have a burst of the renewable bubble because this has been a bubble, and at least in Spain. In Spain, because of the amount of money coming from the next generation funds, many projects are probably going to be abandoned because at the end, for instance, something that we observe here in Spain is that we have installed a lot of new renewable power, while at the same time the electricity consumption is falling. It's falling since the year 2008. So 17 years of fall.
Wow.
Yes, but the
The
same
financial crisis.
yeah, but the question is that the same happens in the European Union. I mean, the energy, the electricity consumption is not growing since 2008 because of the offshoring of factories, because the main consumer of electricity
Right.
are electro-intensive industries. Many of them have flight away to China and other places. So at the end, the question is that, well, you are consuming less and less electricity, but we have more and more systems that produce less reliable electricity. I think this is a plan without fissures. Everything is a fissure. I mean, everything is completely wrong from the beginning. Now they have realized it. All these bureaucrats at Brussels have realized that it's not working. They have realized that the money is fleeing away from renewable. And this is the reason that they are now going for a different plan. And the new plan is okay. Taking into account the United States have decided not to provide any more this support, this military support, this state support, and so on. We are going to build it ourselves. So we are going to build a very big army that is able first to say, okay, we are a superpower at the same level as United States and Russia. Well, Russia has never been a real competitor on that, but anyway, the United States. And also, we are going to claim for these resources in North Africa that we think that otherwise we are not going to obtain. This is absolutely silly from my point of view. I mean, this is, and my hope is that this is not going to work. And it is very sad. But at the end, it seems that one needs to wish that Europe collapses before doing something like that. This is very sad,
That's a
but
fair
it's the way
wish.
it is. Or
Yeah, I
we have
understand
also
that.
the option of trying to get rid of our leaders. Maybe this should be better.
I mean, I agree with your diagnosis broadly that the human systems are collapsing and the planetary systems that support them are also in the process of degrading because of the impact of human activity. It cannot just continue forever, and no matter the focus on economic growth and the energy input and material input that demands, the planet will stop things in the end sooner or later. Because the planet is finite. And so what we do in the next few years really matters. It does seem that there is just simply no way to have a kind of unlimited growth model on a finite planet, and yet nobody is willing to confront that. And so it's much more likely that we sort of run our societies into the ground before actually doing anything meaningful, because this isn't an engineering problem. This is an ideological problem, you know?
Yeah.
But something that I think is really interesting to consider, and I know you've written about this too, alongside all of that, is the fact that our economies are still kind of ballooning. They're not, growing at the rate that they once were, but they are still ballooning, and wealth is flooding to the top. And it does seem to me that there is an awareness of the finitude of resources in private circles, even if that's not discussed publicly, and a willingness to create a segregated society so as to ensure that certain people have access to the things that they need in order to facilitate their lifestyles and everybody else has less. And the difference between right now versus sort of the previous eras of human history is that before it was the purchasing power of the middle class that was kind of pushing wealth to the elite, whereas now it's not the purchasing power of the middle class. The elite have seemed to have created these fictionalized financial systems whereby they can kind of create money purely off of betting on Earth's resources and never mind everybody else. And I think that means that we're in a particularly dangerous period whereby it doesn't really matter what happens to the rest of us. As long as our bodies are available to still provide the labor where necessary, and as long as some people still manage to move up because they have good creative talent, I mean, we're going to see the things that we consider to be normal in Europe or the United States become luxury goods, aren't we?
Yeah, in fact, what you have described is something that we are actively discussing here in Spain as eco-fascism, which at the end is the idea that you can have a running elite being able to access resources and the vast majority of the people being degraded to abject misery. And the system is kept in order and running because it becomes quite authoritarian and you have a lot of repression. And I think that we are slowly, or not such a slowly, slipping in that direction, at least in Europe and in other places, because many positions that, I think that a decade ago, the amount of repression I am now observing against environmentalist groups or just demonstrators, all the people demonstrating in favor of Palestine, nothing else. And the way they have been repressed all over Europe is absolutely amazing. Because a decade ago, we should have considered, okay, well, they are just using their freedom of speech to express their opinion. But now, not all the opinions are tolerated. And this is something that is getting worse and worse as time passes. Well, you probably know the cases of people that have had troubles at the US border immigration because they have expressed opinions contrary to what Trump is doing or what the policy that the United States is having at Gaza, for instance. That's for
Even
expressing
opinions,
opinion.
sorry, but even opinions expressed in private because they're
Yes,
going through
yes,
private messaging services. You don't
exact,
even have to be on a
exact,
soapbox. You could just be texting your mates.
exact. So, what is meaning that freedom of speech, in some sense, is there. So, I think that we are going in that direction because I tend to agree with the idea that at least a part of the elite, the real elite, the people that really knows, are aware of the problems that we have ahead. Disregarding the temporal horizon, we tend to focus a lot of when exactly this is going to happen, when because it's happening, when it doesn't really matter a lot. The question is that we are entering a historical process that for sure is going to take years, see, decades to develop, but we are entering up the process in which everything is going to be unstabilized, everything is going to be chaotic, everything is going to be complicated. Those guys know that, and I think that they are just taking positions, they're preparing themselves to be in the better shape for what is going on. And well, this can take different aspects. For instance, Yanis Varoufakis talks about techno-feudalism. Here, Spanish thinkers tend to talk more about eco-fascism. These are very similar concepts at the end. So the idea at the end is, well, an authoritarian system in which the wealth is not well distributed, for sure, because that for that reason it is authoritarian, inside our borders, which is a kind of novelty for us as regarded from the past decades, because if we go a century and a half ago, for instance, there was also the common situation. So this is funny. I many times I think about this is the way in which the middle classes in Western Europe, for instance, or in Europe in general, um, do not know history. So the way in which they ignore history, even if history is saying, okay, but this kind of things has happened in the past for given reasons, the
Yeah.
reasons are coming back and the things are likely to happen again. And something that sometimes I found, because I give a lot of talks for many different people, I mean, typically ONGs, associations, sometimes for enterprises also. And it is very funny because people, I always say, well, but we need to keep this, or they cannot take this from us. And I say, okay, all the rights that we have now are conquest. It's not something that you have been given, it's something you
Yeah.
have conquered. And you need to conquer again, and you maybe need to fight just to keep it. And it's something that, I mean, history tells us a lot of times, but for one reason or other, it has to do with all the propaganda machinery that we have. But people do not realize that the things are not given, and everything that you have, you can lose. And in fact, we are losing it. We are losing it. I mean, many people are not very aware or are not very concerned. And especially with the things that have to do with freedom of speech, I think this is quite serious actually, because it will
Mm.
arrive a moment at which, for instance, you and me, we could not have this conversation. Even the fact that we have had this conversation probably is putting you and me in some blacklist, but probably we were already there, so it doesn't
Yeah,
matter a lot.
I mean, I think so. Yeah, I used to be the producer of Radio Free Sarawak, which is the only independent news station in Malaysia on the island of Borneo. And it was sort of made by Indigenous people for Indigenous people with a bit of support from London, a very small team. And that show was so successful because it started broadcasting to indigenous groups what was happening to the forest, why it was happening to the forest, and how it was connected to national politics.
Mm-mm.
And so the government started jamming the radio waves, you know, like, and
Nobody's
this is
surprised. Yeah.
yeah, well, but it's not surprising. But this is the thing. This happened a decade ago. This happened a decade ago on this planet, and this I think is what is so sort of particular about sort of Western exceptionalism is this idea of like it can happen over there, but it can't happen over here. Like what has happened to women in Afghanistan over the past 2 years, it should have shocked all women around the world into sort of taking up arms against these patriarchal, violent, fascistic regimes. Because if it happens over there, it can happen here. That's the rule of the planet. Everything is interconnected, whether you think about it on a biodiversity level, like a biological level, or a quantum level, and a political level. And I think, you know, you said that we got those rights of ours, those civil rights of ours, you know, through conquest, not just through conquest as well, also through the fact that, you know, our elite regimes and our governments were off extracting from other bodies elsewhere. And so the rewards of that were coming in, they were trickling down. It was the one time trickle down economics actually provided something. There was such an abundance of resources and energy through neocolonialism and physical extractivism that they could afford to raise up some other bodies. And now that we're running out, what do you think is going to happen? All the other bodies are going to be pushed back down and extracted from again.
Yes, and something that, for instance, it worries me a lot in Spain. I don't know what happens in your country, but in Spain, something that is realized in young people, there is a real renewal of male supremacism,
Yeah.
which is absolutely, for me, it's astonishing. And of course, it's nauseating because you realize we are getting back. I have an age myself. And this remembers me when I was born. General Franco was still alive. Yeah,
Yeah.
but he died when I was 5 years old. But the problem is that I am from a part of Spain in which it took some time to get rid of all that shit. But the question is that things that I observed when I was young, and all the evolution that Spain underwent, how the thing changes, the way of thinking, the way being more respectful with minorities, taking into account that women has rights. This was already
Mm.
a big advancement. And also the idea that they should be treated in equal foot than men. Well, something that we have not really completed. We have
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
some difference and so on. But now, what I see in the young people that is absolutely astonishing is that they are getting back to ideas which are really very reactionary and quite violent. with women. And this is also a way to consolidate the power of this eco-fascism or whatever thing that is being generated here, because this gives these young people something meaningful in their lives, in the sense that they have this feeling of belonging to something which is better, greater than them. So their life is absolutely miserable. Probably they're going to have very miserable salaries. They are not going to have housing conditions which are good.
Mm-hmm.
They are going to work in very bad jobs and so on. But they belong to something which is greater than them. And
Yeah.
also, they can feel superior to a half of the population. And
Yeah.
all of that, give them comfort in a situation
Yeah.
which is quite uncomfortable. And it is amazing to see how well the discourse works. For me, it's absolutely
Mm-hmm.
amazing, because instead of rebelling against the state of things, many people, I mean, not I would not say everyone, because it's not true, and probably it's not the majority, but a significant part of the young people is falling into that. And we observe a rise of right wing and populistic support to populistic parties in people aged less than 20, which for me is absolutely amazing, because you know this should sound the contrary to modern. But as they do not have history, this is quite interesting, because they ignore history. Something that also we should be grateful to the changes in the educational system that has favored this ignorance of the history. There was a famous Spanish philosopher, famous in Spain, that Ortega y Gasset, that said that the people that ignore their history are condemned to repeat it.
I am. I think it makes sense, the rise in young men who are attracted to populist parties or policies, because I think it's those people who are speaking to them rather than about them. I think the answer on the left, in a kind of noble bid to protect what it deemed marginalized communities, only spoke about the category of young men as political identity
Hmm,
as negative and as having a negative impact on other identities, and forgot the lived experience of what it is for many young men to live in a male body today, which is to experience, like everybody else, degrading living conditions, degrading economic opportunities, degraded educational opportunities,
hmm,
and also degraded love, sex, all these other opportunities that were easier in their
hmm,
father's times, quite frankly. And so do make things look better. It's very easy then to construct a narrative and say it was better for you back then. And top that all off with the profound fear that I think most young people experience, whether it's their sort of massively raised collective consciousness with regards to the state of the planet, the state of their own economic condition, the state of the world more generally. Fear drives people to have power over others. We know
yeah.
that it's very simple. It makes sense as to why young men, without another option that is as easily and readily available to them, because it is, sure, like, hey, don't be an arsehole, but that takes a lot of, cultural conditioning, and you need support, and, there's no equivalent of Andrew Tate on the internet telling them how to do that. So I think it's understandable. I do think there's also a really other interesting connection, Antonio, because I'm writing a book about this at the moment, about the connection between violence against women and violence against the earth. The connection between resource scarcity and women's bodies now
Hmm,
being categorized again as a resource, and the attack on reproductive healthcare, the attack on reproductive rights, attack on reproductive sovereignty, bodily autonomy, I think is absolutely and fundamentally connected with the renewed attack on extracting from the planet in a more obvious and violent way, because things are going to run out, because women's bodies are always the first primary resource.
yes.
And I just want to tell you a story, if I may. Not a story, a myth. The rape of the Sabines, um, which was, it's this myth about how Rome essentially managed to sort of come to power. In it, Rome is a struggling nation state. It's very young. Romulus is still there. It's opened its borders to everybody, which meant essentially that all the criminals, all the criminals and all the men that have nowhere else to go have kind of flooded into its borders, and not enough women. So Rome is on the brink of collapse because Romans aren't being born. And so Romulus comes up with this plan and invites all of the Sabines, their neighbouring Sabines, to this sort of weekend of debauchery and festivities and games. And on his cue, the Roman men capture the Sabine women and they take them deep within the city. And they are instructed not to rape them that evening, not to have intercourse with them. Because in the following morning, once the Roman men have fought off the Sabine men, Romulus conducts this mass marriage of Roman men and Sabine women so that any child born to that woman will now be Roman, because that is what Rome needs to survive. It needs Roman blood, it needs Roman flesh. Women's bodies are the source of cultural reproduction, and bodies are the force of physical production, if you will. And that is how Rome survives and becomes the great empire that it was today, essentially. And I think it's such an acute and fascinating story for showing just how pertinent women's bodies are to sort of to mankind's vision and mankind's creations and mankind's infrastructure. In the same way that, you know, countries all around the world are panicking about falling birth rates, and rather than just open up their borders and take in young immigrants from other places that are desperate to have somewhere else to go, they are focusing on, we need Italian babies or white American babies or British babies, or, and whatever any of that means, whatever that means. And so I think the renewed rise of male supremacy makes sense for a period of resource scarcity.
For me, it makes a lot of sense because it's what you have said at the end. Is the first kind of appropriation, is the first kind of extractivism, and it is quite obvious because it has always been along the history. This is something that has been repeated along the history. So, and you know, all imperium were mainly patriarch. I don't know how do you say this. Sorry.
Patriarchal.
Patriarchal. Okay. So, and because this is a requirement, this is a must, because you need to control every aspect of the production, and this implies that you need to control this reproduction. So this, you know, we have always this distinction between productive task and reproductive task. All those guys that are so worried because of the low birth rates in the different countries, they should analyze first why people is having this low birth rate. Maybe because the living conditions in your country are very bad. And this is a way to adapt to a harsh condition. If you have a thriving country, probably the reproduction of the people will be going to be much better. So instead of acting on the things that are degrading the living standards of the people, you are imposing the people to reproduce, and in a specific given manner.
Yes.
So
yes,
this is
absolutely.
appropriation by definition. So yes, at the end, taking into account something which is interesting, that the main problem right now, we are arriving to this point on history in which trying to keep the gain taxes of the capital is harder and harder. So capital needs to reproduce because it is the essence of capitalism. And the problem is that the return of investment is smaller and smaller as time passes. And they have tried to this trick of fleeing into the mainly financial economy. So just putting some digits in computers and so on, something which is completely imaginary. But at the end, they need a physical support for everything. So any reproduction of capital at the end needs to be based on something which is physical, and the world is finite, as you have said. So if the world is finite, at the end, the opportunities are finite. So I think that they know that capitalism is arriving to its last contradictions. So they are preparing themselves to be the new lords of the new situation, be it feudal or whatever. But in any way, for sure, is something which is going to be, as usual, non-egalitarian, but as in contrast with the current situation in which there will be no middle class. So people that have had the opportunity to attain good education as you and me, this is going to be rarer and rarer as time passes. And I think, because just to transmit a positive message, which I think is important, is that I think we have the opportunity to fight for this, and we should fight for this. The first condition to be able to fight for something is to be aware this something is happening. Because the main success of this propaganda, this capitalist propaganda, is that nothing is happening, everything is fine, or everything is normal, or we have in a temporary setback, but we are going back to normal in short. So the idea is that this abnormality can be kept is something that needs to be fight. We need to fight. We need to fight this idea with all our forces and to make a lot of pedagogy to explain people to make sense of the things they are experiencing, to make sense of the problems they are having, to give an appropriate interpretation. And just to finish up something, this is an idea that also I repeat a lot here in Spain. We have a problem with the parties that call themselves leftists or whatever they are, because I don't know, because they are completely skipping discussing the problems that population have. And at the end, they are indistinguishable from the others, so they are part of the problem. And as you have said, we need an alternative because populistic movements, they are reading very clearly the situation, they are understanding very well what is going on, and they are doing their homework, and we are not doing ours. So we need to provide an alternative discourse, an alternative movement. We need to organize things in order to allow people to see that another way of doing things is possible. It's not only possible, but also that it's best than the alternative. But this is something that needs to be constructed. So, well, I'm very happy that you have me in your show. So, because I think this is something that contributes. Maybe it's a grain of the sand, but anyway, any grain of sand is important to make the beach.
Thank you very much, Antonio. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I think that you will enjoy probably if you have the opportunity to discuss with Pedro Prieto, who is a retired engineer. It's a guy with a lot of experience. He was in Iraq while the Iraq-Iran war started. This guy has been discussing a lot about the renewable transition, peak oil, the problem of the fossil fuel scarcity. He's very critical with the system. This guy tried to make his contribution to the energy transition. He's still running a couple of photovoltaic plants here in Spain. And precisely for that, he has realized that nothing of this works. He's a very critical guy, and he's very funny. So you have the opportunity of having him. I think it is worth it. And if you allow me, I can suggest a second name that I think is also very interesting. It's a completely different part of the spectrum. Is Yorgos Kallis, who is a professor here in Barcelona at the University of Autónoma.
Degrowth guy.
You know him?
Yorgos Kallis, I know the name. I'm sure I've read papers of his. He studies degrowth, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a very interesting guy also. And now he has a European project on the ground. This is amazing. This is amazing. So they are funding studies on the ground. Well, of course, well, we have an expression here in Spain. Yes, you're lighting a candle to God and another candle to the demon. So you have all the options covered. So.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio. I really appreciate that. And I look forward to speaking with both of them. And thank you for this conversation. It has been electrifying, if you will. I've really enjoyed it.
So it has been a pleasure to be also.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.